In this module, we're going to discuss some of the critiques of the criminal justice system, its inherent weaknesses and limitations, especially in relation to its crime control function. And then we're going to talk about some alternatives to the criminal justice system. And of course, the two are interrelated in the sense that alternatives to the criminal justice system arose as a result of the limitations of the criminal justice system. So the alternatives we're going to talk about are in many ways antithetical to the criminal justice system in the sense that they address many of the limitations of the criminal justice system with respect to its crime control function. So we shall begin this lecture by outlining some of the main critiques of the criminal justice system, and then we'll talk about different alternatives to the criminal justice system in respect of crime control. This will include crime prevention, restorative justice, and what is known as the public health approach. And in particular, we're going to be looking at drug courts. We briefly discussed some of the critiques of the criminal justice system in the very first module of this course, but it's good to revisit these critiques, especially now that you have a much more in-depth grasp of the criminal justice system in Canada. So the first critique is that the traditional criminal justice system is unable to cope with the actual quantity of crime. It simply does not have the resources to identify, let alone bring to justice, all the criminal acts and all the criminal offenders in society. It simply would be unrealistic to be able to do so. So certainly a critique of the criminal justice system is that it simply cannot cope with the actual quantity of crime in Canada or any country for that matter. Second critique is that it fails to identify many criminal offenders and bring them to justice. So not only is it unable to identify or deal with the actual quantity of crime, but it has significant difficulty in actually identifying criminal offenders that have caused crime or behind a significant amount of crime. And this includes chronic habitual offenders, many of whom are responsible for a disproportionate amount of crime, but we also know that a great majority, or at least a significant proportion of these chronic offenders are not actually identified. And the same can be said for non-chronic offenders, and we can say here fairly confidently that the vast majority of people who commit crimes are not caught. Just think of how many drug transactions take place during a day which are not identified, or how many theft from auto are not reported to police, for example, or even tragically how many domestic assaults take place between a husband and a wife that are never reported, let alone brought to justice. So similar to the critique that the criminal justice system is unable to cope with the actual quantity of crime, it also fails to identify the majority of criminal offenders, let alone bring them to justice and incarcerate them. A third critique is that the criminal justice system fails to rehabilitate those offenders who are identified by the criminal justice system. It first should be said that a very, very small proportion of the criminal justice system budget is dedicated to rehabilitation. Much of rehabilitation within the criminal justice system takes place within corrections, and a very small percentage of correctional budgets are dedicated to rehabilitation. It's probably around 10%, but even maybe lower in some provinces. And rehabilitation is a significant part of the criminal justice system, at least it should be. But again, the majority of the rehabilitation or treatment takes place outside the system. It takes place in communities, and although there is certainly some funding for treatment and rehabilitation that is allocated by criminal justice agencies, the majority of this funding comes from other sources such as the healthcare system. And so it's the healthcare system that tends to bear the brunt of, say, for example, substance abuse treatment. So not only does the criminal justice system not rehabilitate offenders to the extent that society requires such rehabilitation, but it has a very small budget to do so. Perhaps one of the most scathing criticisms of the criminal justice system in pursuit of its crime control objectives is that it fails to address the underlying factors associated with crime and criminality. In other words, the criminal justice system simply addresses the symptoms of much deeper social problems. And this is a major problem because here we have an institution that receives billions upon billions of dollars every year in taxpayer money, and all it really does is simply address the symptoms of the problem. It does not address the root causes of criminality within society. At least a very, very tiny proportion is dedicated to addressing the root causes of criminality. In recent years, different funding programs and different agencies have sprung up in Canada to prevent criminality and prevent crime, such as the National Crime Prevention Centre, which is a part of Public Safety Canada and is located in Ottawa, and provides funding for very worthwhile crime prevention projects that address causes of criminality, such as working with at-risk kids. But the proportion of funding dedicated to crime prevention is infinitesimally small compared to the budget that is dedicated to policing and courts and prosecution and corrections. So this is a particularly scathing critique of the criminal justice system, is that it fails to actually address the causes of the problem. It only addresses the symptoms of problems. And one could argue that it was never really designed to address the causes of the problem. But again, think about any institution that receives this much money from taxpayers and only addresses the symptoms of the problem. And that's obviously problematic for society. Another critique is that the correctional system may in fact promote crime and criminal behavior. So when offenders go to jail, they network with other offenders, they learn from other offenders, gangs are formed in prison, gangs formed on the outside are continued through prison. So the argument is that not only does the criminal justice system have significant problems in controlling crime in society, but it may in fact promote crime through correctional systems, through the networking of criminals, but also because of the environment of a correctional system. It's not one that's conducive to rehabilitation. Quite the opposite. It's more conducive to fostering criminality and aggravating the factors that lead to criminal behavior, because it's such a horrible life to be in prison and it simply is one that can aggravate criminal predispositions. We know that the criminal justice system is not always fair. We know that the system is not always just. And this is obviously a significant criticism of the criminal justice system in that it may in fact discriminate against visible minorities and the poor. Particularly within Canada, there is certainly ample evidence to suggest that there is a significant amount of discrimination against Aboriginal people, against African Canadians, and against people from low socioeconomic status backgrounds. And when I mention the poor as a group that's discriminated by the criminal justice system, basically what I mean here is that the system is biased towards those who have money and can pay fines, and more importantly can afford a good lawyer. And this is an inherent bias of most criminal justice systems. While the law applies equally to all, it's certainly true that the more money you have, the better lawyer you can hire, and the better chance you will be cleared of a charge. And so when discriminating against, say, the poor, the argument's been is that the criminal justice system tends to focus on crimes that are more committed by people from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, like property crime, theft from auto, break-and-enter, armed robbery. And the argument follows that it ignores crimes committed by the rich and the powerful, so white-collar crime, political corruption, embezzlement, accounting fraud, corporate crime, for example. So in short, there's ample evidence that the criminal justice system does discriminate against visible minorities, and we know that because of the disparity in sentences based on race. We know that African Canadians and Aboriginal people get much harsher and longer sentences or incarcerated more often compared to quote unquote white people, white offenders who've basically committed the same crime under the same circumstances. To sum up, the criminal justice system does discriminate against visible minorities and the poor. And although certainly steps have been taken to address this, this is an endemic problem with systems in Canada and the United States and throughout the world. Finally, a problem that permeates most criminal justice systems, in particular Canada, is that it's insufficiently resourced. We simply do not have the resources to identify all the offenders, to identify all the crimes that are being committed. And there's significant limitation in resource to such areas as prosecution. And today in Canada, I would argue that the one area that's most under-resourced in Canada as far as the criminal justice system is concerned is Crown prosecutions and legal aid to some extent. But you talk to any Crown prosecutor and they'll tell you how many cases they have to juggle in a day and how that can serve to undermine the ability to successfully prosecute cases. And in light of the new legislation, Bill C-10, which brings about mandatory minimum sentences, the Crown is arguing that this is going to even tax the system even more. Because more cases are going to be brought to trial now because of the mandatory minimum sentences. And B, they argue that mandatory minimum sentences takes away their ability to plea bargain because they have no way to plea bargain now. If an offender faces a mandatory minimum sentence, the Crown cannot bargain for a lesser sentence. And so this takes away their plea bargaining. And when you plea bargain, you divert resources away from the criminal justice system. You need less resources because cases don't go to trial. But the same with when you have limited resources, that leads to other injustices. And again, such injustices as defendants having to wait years for their cases to come to trial. In short, there are numerous critiques and limitations of the criminal justice system. Some of these are structural in that these limitations are inherent in the mandate of the criminal justice system, such as the inability to address the root causes of criminal behavior, which it really was never designed to do. And some of these are more operational in the sense that, for example, the lack of resources simply aggravates some of the underlying problems and underlying weaknesses of the criminal justice system. So now we'll turn to alternatives to the criminal justice system. And again, many of these alternatives, including crime prevention, which we'll discuss first, arose as a specific critique and alternative which addresses the limitations of the criminal justice system. One of the clear alternatives to the criminal justice system as far as controlling crime in society is concerned is what is known as crime prevention. And crime prevention can be broadly defined as any preemptive intervention intended to block or reduce the likelihood of the occurrence of a criminal act at a given location or the onset of criminal behavior within an individual. Now, this is a very expansive definition, and this expansive definition is purposeful because it reflects the expansiveness of the crime prevention field, both theoretically and in implied terms. This highly inclusive definition is also acknowledgement of the unfinished debate among scholars as to the conceptual parameters that should be applied to crime prevention to distinguish it from the criminal justice system and criminal justice approaches to crime. Now, despite disagreements as to what should be defined as a preventative approach to crime and criminality, within a theoretical context, crime prevention is distinguished from the criminal justice system through a number of different factors, and we'll go through some of these factors that distinguish crime prevention from the criminal justice system, and then we'll get specifically into different types of crime prevention approaches. So the first distinguishing characteristic of crime prevention is that it's proactive. It attempts to prevent problems from becoming crime problems. So in particular, it tries to prevent criminal behavior, for example, by working with at-risk children and youth, working with kids who are at risk of future delinquent and criminal behavior. This is certainly the most proactive aspect of the field of crime prevention. So this is what's called crime prevention through social development, and it really symbolizes the field of crime prevention, especially its proactive nature, in the sense that it's being proactive in preventing criminal behavior or criminality from emerging in the first place. And the proactive aspect of crime prevention is not simply with respect to addressing the root causes of criminality, but for example, it's proactive in the sense of what we call situational crime prevention, and that is simply trying to stop a particular crime from occurring in a particular time and place. And this is what's known as situational or opportunity reduction crime prevention. You're not addressing the root causes of crime, but you're still being proactive because you're trying to prevent crime from occurring in a particular time and place. And this is what we do in our everyday lives. We lock doors. We lock the doors of our car. We perhaps may avoid certain locations. Buildings have alarm systems. Buildings have surveillance. We have security guards. Every type of building or structure in society today has some kind of crime prevention, situational crime prevention technique built in or applied to it. And again, this doesn't address the root cause of criminality, but it's proactive in the sense that it is preventing crime by occurring at a particular time and place. Now, in contrast, the criminal justice system is entirely reactive. It's an entirely reactive system in the sense that it only responds to criminal acts and generally can only respond to a criminal act. And so the criminal justice system really only kicks in after a criminal act has occurred. Now, yes, there is some cases where it is proactive and can step in to stop a crime, but the vast majority of the resources within the criminal justice system are reactive in the sense that the whole system responds to crime. And so it's reactive in the sense that it identifies a crime, it tries to identify the offender, and then it prosecutes the offender and punishes the offender. So the whole system is reactive. It reacts to a criminal offense. There is very little proactiveness built into the criminal justice system. As far as the approach is concerned, with the criminal justice system, there's basically one type of approach, and that's intervention. And this flows from the whole reactive role or reactive emphasis of the criminal justice system. So the whole point of the criminal justice system is to intervene after a criminal act has occurred, or in some cases intervene to try to stop a criminal act. But again, the vast majority of the criminal justice system is geared towards intervening after a criminal act has occurred. Crime prevention, on the other hand, is not just about intervention. It has multiple steps. And again, based on its proactive nature, the first step is to predict. And what that means is you're trying to predict whether or not a crime or criminal behavior is going to emerge. And so if you're talking about a particular crime, if you're doing a assessment of a building, what's called a threat and security assessment or risk assessment, the first thing you do in this assessment is you try to predict what kind of crimes are going to occur in this particular place. So if it's a hospital, for example, we know that hospitals are particularly vulnerable to the theft of drugs. So we predict what kind of crimes are going to occur, and then we assess the situation. Well, where are the drugs located? How could the offender break in? What kind of modus operandi can they use to steal the drugs? And so there's a whole analytical phase that ensues after you predict the type of crime that would occur, and then you intervene. And so the approach of crime prevention is far more analytical than the criminal justice system. It's simply not about intervening after a criminal act has occurred. It's about being proactive in the sense that you predict what kind of crime is going to occur, you then assess the situation, and then you intervene in the situation. And the same process is used with respect to addressing the root causes of criminal behavior. So with an at-risk youth, you try to predict what kind of criminal behavior may emerge or what kind of antisocial behavior may emerge. You assess, which means assessing the risk factors. Is it a learning disability? Is it a psychological disorder? Is it anger management? Is it poverty? Is it a negative family environment? Is it all of the above? You analyze these risk factors and then you intervene. Now, as far as the response is concerned, the intervention of a crime prevention approach is what we call problem-oriented. And what problem-oriented means is that the solution is supposed to be commensurate with the problem. In other words, the solution or the intervention that one implements is commensurate with the scope and nature of the problem. It really does address the problem, and in particular the root cause of the problem. And so crime prevention very much encompasses a wide range of appropriate solutions. And it has to incorporate a wide range of solutions because the problems, the crime and criminality problems, are so diverse. And so every crime problem or every potential crime problem has unique characteristics. And those unique characteristics have to be dealt with uniquely through a set of interventions that's specific to that problem and to that environment. And again, the same can be said for children and youth and even adults who are at risk of criminal behavior or have been engaged in criminal behavior. Their risk factors are unique, and therefore the way they're treated and prevented have to be unique. So every at-risk child has a unique set of risk factors, and those risk factors need to be addressed in a very individualized fashion. Now, this is held in contrast to the criminal justice system because the criminal justice system really relies on a very narrow set of solutions. And the set of solutions is basically punishment is your most predominant solution, whether it's something as light as probation or all the way up to capital punishment. But the criminal justice system relies on a very narrow set of solutions to the problem, in that you arrest the offender, you prosecute the offender, you punish the offender, and that's really it. So there's very much a cookie cutter approach to the criminal justice system, a very narrow range of solutions. And in contrast, crime prevention is follows the problem-oriented approach, which means there is a wide range of solutions that should be highly individualized to each situation. As far as responsibility is concerned, we know that the criminal justice system is almost entirely controlled by the state, by government. Communities sometimes have input, and that certainly has increased in recent years, but they do not control the budgets, they do not control policy, they do not set priorities, and so the criminal justice system is funded and run by the state. That's it, period. With respect to crime prevention, theoretically, responsibility is to be invested in the citizenry, in the civil society, in private actors. And by private actors, we mean individual community members, entire neighborhoods, community groups, the private sector, really any actor outside of the formal state. And so the argument is that while the state responds to crime and is in a reactive sense through the criminal justice system, it's really up to the citizenry to take the lead in preventative approaches. So while the police do play a very important role in crime prevention, especially in recent years, the argument is that theoretically the lead should be adopted by citizens, by communities. So crime prevention should be community-based. And this is postmodern in the sense that it goes back to the very initial tenets of crime control within European societies and pre-industrial villages, and that is that the community has control over order maintenance and crime control. It's the responsibility of communities. And that's a fundamental premise of crime prevention today, in that while the state has responsibility over the reactive criminal justice system, it's citizenry, it's the communities that should take the lead in crime prevention and proactive crime preventative interventions in partnership with police, but theoretically it's the communities that should be taking the lead. So whether you are designing a neighborhood watch program or whether you're designing programs for at-risk youth, These are done through community-based organizations or community institutions, including the schools or healthcare systems. And again, while the schools and healthcare systems are funded by the state, control is supposed to be vested within communities, and the communities and private actors are to take the lead. As far as how we control the problem of crime, there's a fundamental difference between what we call informal social control and formal social control. So the criminal justice system is an example of formal social control. In fact, formal social control and the criminal justice system are synonymous. So what we mean by formal social control is that crime is prevented and controlled through such formal mechanisms as laws, as agencies like the police or the courts or correctional systems. So formal social control is the formalized approach to controlling crime. Informal social control is different. What informal social control refers to are unwritten laws, are unwritten norms and values that people in civil society hold dear and obey as a means to regulate themselves and to control crime. And so informal social control operates at the societal level, and it also operates, for example, at the neighborhood level. And we'll talk a bit more about informal social control when we talk about community crime prevention. But basically, informal social control is people looking after one another and regulating and policing their own environment through unwritten values and their own norms and the enforcement of these norms. And again, we'll talk a little more about how informal social control is central to crime prevention when we talk about community crime prevention. But suffice to say, without informal social control, there's no way that the criminal justice system would be able to maintain order in society. Informal social control is what holds societies together. It's not punishment or the threat of punishment that deters people from engaging in criminal acts. It's individuals' ability to appreciate the difference between right and wrong and their own moral compass. And most people have a moral compass that basically allows them to delineate between right and wrong and to try to minimize any type of unlawful behavior. And that's a central part of informal social control. It's simply people respecting the laws, respecting the values of society. And Canadians have always been held out of being very law-abiding, deferential people. But if you do not have informal social control, there's no way that the criminal justice system would be able to maintain law and order in society. So much of law and order in society is not maintained through the criminal justice system. It's simply maintained through what's called informal social control. And that is people's ability and their willingness to respect laws and to respect certain values and norms that are universally accepted. As far as the scope of the criminal justice system is concerned, as we've alluded to earlier, that it's really focused on the criminal act. Everything revolves around the criminal act. You cannot arrest an offender without a criminal act. You can't prosecute him. They can't put an offender in jail. So everything revolves around the criminal act as far as the criminal justice system is concerned. You cannot proceed unless you've identified a criminal act. With crime prevention, the focus is much broader. Yes, it is focused on the criminal act, in particular trying to deter criminal offenses through situational crime prevention. But crime prevention is much broader. It also focuses on criminality, which is basically criminal behavior. So it tries to address the causes of criminality in particular. It addresses disorder problems, so a particular approach of crime prevention is to address incivilities and disorder problems in society. These are problems that are not criminal in scope, but they can lead to more significant problems. So disorder issues like graffiti or public urination or public drunkenness, public loitering, simply incivil behavior within society. The argument is if these disorder problems are not addressed, they can lead to more significant problems. So there are particular approaches within crime prevention that address disorder. And finally, crime prevention also tries to address fear of crime. Many argue that fear of crime is as debilitating as crime itself. And so part of crime prevention is helping people understand the true scope and nature of crime and address their fear. And this is particularly cogent with respect to victims of crime, trying to work with victims of crime and allay their fear, and also to populations that have a particularly high level of fear of crime, such as seniors. Seniors are actually a group within society that has a fairly low victimization rate, but there tends to be a high rate of fear of crime among seniors. And so some crime prevention work is directed towards addressing this fear of crime. Finally, as far as the target is concerned, the criminal justice system's primary target is the offender. Again, you identify the offender, you arrest the offender, prosecute the offender, you put the offender in jail. So everything sort of revolves around the offender as far as the criminal justice processing is concerned. With crime prevention, the actual focus is on the victim or potential victim, so trying to prevent people from being victims of crime, and the other emphasis is on the potential offender. In other words, working with children and youth who are at risk of becoming offenders, so addressing the root causes of criminal offending. So as you can see in this matrix, there are fundamental differences between crime prevention and the criminal justice system. And while they're diametrically opposed in many respects, they're also very complementary. And so crime prevention is meant to complement criminal justice system. And again, the reason that crime prevention is diametrically opposed to the criminal justice system is that the approaches in crime prevention are very much based on the limitations of the criminal justice system. So in other words, to complement the criminal justice system. So while the two are complementary, the unfortunate fact is that the vast majority of resources are dedicated to the criminal justice system, and a very insignificant portion of government funding actually goes towards crime prevention. We'll now turn our attention to some basic approaches that fall within the field of crime prevention. And you can basically break down crime prevention approaches into four categories. The first is what's called developmental crime prevention, or crime prevention through social development, which are interventions designed to prevent the development of criminal potential in children and youth. So basically addressing the root causes of criminal behavior within at-risk children and youth. Situational or opportunity reduction crime prevention, which are interventions designed to reduce the opportunity for crime to occur in a particular time and place. Community crime prevention, which consists of efforts to reinforce or modify the behavior of local residents to take control over their own environment. And this is very much in line with the whole concept of informal social control. And finally, crime prevention has also very much influenced policing. And so community and problem-oriented policing can certainly be considered a crime prevention approach because it very much advocates a proactive approach to addressing crime, to preventing crime, and in particular strong partnerships between police and the community to address the root causes of crime in a particular environment. So now we'll look at each of these approaches in a little more depth. Developmental crime prevention, or crime prevention through social development, entails interventions that attempt to address the root causes of criminal behavior within children and youth who are at risk of future criminal or delinquent behavior. So the underlying theoretical premise of developmental crime prevention is that chronic offenders tend to be disadvantaged in several areas of their lives, particularly in their childhood and their adolescence. In other words, the root causes of criminal behavior among chronic offenders, among adult chronic offenders, can be found in childhood and adolescence. And there's a number of risk factors that are detailed in one of your required readings, but it's everything from dysfunctional families to poor neighborhoods to negative role models to learning disabilities to psychological disorders, mental health problems. Again, the number of risk factors is very broad, but the argument is that the more risk factors within the life of a child or youth, the more at risk they are of engaging in delinquent and criminal behavior. It's not a fait accompli that they're going to become criminal. It's simply they're more at risk because of these risk factors. So crime prevention through social development basically tries to replace these risk factors with what we call protective factors. And protective factors are essentially the social developmental or crime prevention through social development interventions. So various kinds of interventions are used. And again, because we have so many different types of risk factors, the intervention will vary with the risk factors that are identified. But generally speaking, some of the crime prevention through social development interventions that have shown to work include mentoring, tutoring, social and life skills development, which will include helping to address anger management issues within kids, helping to address a learning disability, helping to address, for example, lack of empathy, interpersonal skills. So it's really providing youth with the kind of skills needed to thrive and survive within civil society. Parental training and support is a critical aspect of crime prevention through social development. We know that a lot of at-risk kids come from very dysfunctional families, families that are broken in the sense that there's been divorce or violence within the home, where the parents are involved in criminality, where the parents are involved in substance abuse, where the parents basically are harsh in their punishment or don't show enough love and concern for their kids. So we know that a lot of chronic offenders come from very broken homes. And so a significant focus of crime prevention through social development is working with parents to become better parents, to become more loving parents, to become more nurturing parents, and make the home life of kids a loving, nurturing, positive experience. And again, the more positive the experience within the home as a child, the less chance a child is going to develop delinquent or criminal behaviors as they get older. As youth get older, job training and job placement is considered a crime prevention through social development intervention, and certainly treatment of psychological and mental health problems are an essential aspect of social developmental approaches. So in summary, crime prevention through social development, it really personifies crime prevention in that it truly is proactive and it truly addresses the root causes of criminality. And you talk to pretty much any criminologist and they will tell you that to truly address crime in society, we need resources to work with the most at-risk kids within the most at-risk communities. And social development approaches have been shown to work. And not only that, they're very cost effective. So it's much cheaper to work in a preventative mode with children and youth than to incarcerate an offender. So the argument is that for every dollar you spend on preventative approaches, whether it's mentoring or tutoring or daycare, you save $7 down the road in criminal justice expenses. And the great thing about crime prevention through social development as well is that factors that put kids at risk of criminal behavior are the same factors that put them at risk of a whole range of antisocial behavior. So everything from violence to suicide, homelessness, chronic unemployment. And so if you can address risk factors generally among kids and youth, you can address a whole range of antisocial behavior, including criminal behavior, down the road. So as you can see, it's a very cost-effective and a very effective approach, not only to preventing criminal behavior, but preventing a whole wide range of antisocial behavior that can have a significant impact on society. While social developmental crime prevention addresses the root causes of crime, situational crime prevention focuses on the criminal act itself. So it's not concerned with root causes of crime, it's concerned with preventing a criminal act from occurring in a particular time and place. And that's why it's called situational crime prevention. It's focused on a particular situation where a crime may occur. So in a nutshell, situational crime prevention involves the management, design, or manipulation of the immediate physical environment to prevent a crime from occurring in a particular time and place. So what you're basically doing is reducing the opportunity for a crime to occur. And you do so through three basic methods. You make it harder for someone to commit a criminal act, so such as making it harder to break into a building, or harder to steal something from an individual. It's often what we call target hardening. So you harden the target. You lock doors and you put up fences, and you have guard dogs or security guards. So it's basically you make it harder for someone to actually commit a criminal offense. The second way to reduce opportunity is by increasing the risk of detection and apprehension. And so one of the best ways to do so is through surveillance. And this can be surveillance by neighborhood residents, surveillance by security guards within a commercial establishment. Surveillance can be conducted through closed circuit television cameras. But the argument here is that if you have surveillance, then you're not making it harder for an offender to break in somewhere, but you are increasing the risk that they'll be detected and then apprehended. And the third approach is what we call reducing the anticipated rewards. And basically what this entails is removing items that are easy to steal or are the target of theft. So for example, jewelry stores remove the jewelry from their window displays at night. If you go to a shopping mall, there's always signs saying, take your goods that you've purchased out of the back seat and put it into the trunk so they're not visible. So there's basically, again, three ways to reduce the opportunity of crime. The system that's used the most is target hardening, but the whole idea of surveillance, neighborhood surveillance or formal surveillance through CCTV cameras is also considered a very effective way to prevent the opportunity of crime occurring by, again, reducing the risk that the offender can actually go unnoticed within a particular environment. So the opportunity for crime can be reduced in one of two ways. You can either organize the immediate physical environment, so you can redesign the environment, you can put locks, you can put fences, you can put gates up, or you organize individuals. And the best example of this is Neighborhood Watch. Neighborhood Watch is an excellent example of a situational crime prevention technique that really involves organizing people. And basically, there's a lot of overlap with community crime prevention in that you're organizing people to look out for one another, to be vigilant, to identify suspicious people, and to report suspicious people to the police. And so instead of manipulating the environment and manipulating buildings or the physical environment, you are organizing people. And again, you're not organizing them to address the root cause of crime necessarily. You're organizing them to prevent crime from occurring at a particular time and place. And again, Neighborhood Watch, where people come together on a block or in an apartment building to look after one another and to look out for suspicious people, is an excellent example of this community-based approach to situational crime prevention. Now, the major critique of situational crime prevention is, again, that it only addresses the symptoms of crime. It doesn't address the root causes of crime, nor was it ever developed as such. And the other argument is it actually may not prevent crime, it may simply deflect it or displace it. So in other words, if you have a neighborhood watch program in one neighborhood, while you may be preventing crime in that neighborhood, the criminal offender may actually go to other neighborhoods. So in this respect, situational crime prevention may not prevent crime in general. It may prevent it in one particular space or neighborhood, but the critique is that it may actually displace the crime to another locale that does not have the kind of sufficient protection as far as situational crime prevention is concerned. The next form of crime prevention is what we refer to as community crime prevention. And there's two basic approaches to community crime prevention. The first is what's called the community defense approach. And basically what this means is a collective effort of local residents to get together and to defend their community from crime. And so we talked about Neighborhood Watch in the earlier slide, and Neighborhood Watch again is the best example of community defense model in the sense that it's people getting together in a collective effort to prevent crimes from occurring through surveillance primarily. But this is critical because it is one of the most fundamental ways that society prevents crime. Neighborhood Watch but the community defense in general, because many communities don't have a formal neighborhood watch program, but they do have an informal sense of looking out for one another and for identifying suspicious people and calling people. So with many communities or with many neighborhoods, there is an inherent community defense approach within that particular area. And then they can be formalized through neighborhood watch, where police will come in and they will train people on how to detect suspicious activity or suspicious people. They will organize neighborhood residents into a block watch program, and then these neighbors work together on a formal basis. But what really is critical to this community defense model is trying to either reinforce or modify people's behaviors to take responsibility for themselves, for their neighbors, and for public space. And this is, again, a crucial aspect of crime prevention and community aspect, is basically empowering people to assume responsibility for crime reduction, crime control, and crime prevention. And central to the community defense model is this whole concept of informal social control. Informal social control, again, is about people taking responsibility for their environments, for their neighborhood, their apartment building, their neighbors, public spaces. And again, informal social control is simply a informal way that people regulate their environment, and through regulation of the environment, attempt to prevent and control crime. And again, what we mean by informal social control is everything from people perhaps confronting a suspicious person, reporting suspicious activity to police, putting up signs, informal signs saying children at play, perhaps even putting in speed bumps to slow traffic down. But it really comes down to people getting together and working together to enforce sort of unwritten codes and values and norms of that particular neighborhood. And again, research shows that neighborhoods that have a strong sense of informal social control tend to have lower crime rates. Now, the second approach to community crime prevention is what we call a community development approach. And the theoretical premise of this is that crime is partially the result of the loss of community. And what we mean by community is a social cohesiveness of a people in a particular neighborhood. And so there's a difference between what we call a neighborhood and what we call a community. A neighborhood is simply a spatial amalgamation of people living in the same area. A community is characterized by social cohesion. People who identify with their neighborhood, who share the same norms and values of their neighbors, and basically form a kind of a cohesive, organic unit. And ultimately, in the community development approach, you want to turn a neighborhood into a community. In other words, you want to take a neighborhood which is full of people who are lightly or slightly engaged with another to a community where they see themselves as a socially cohesive group of individuals, a collective. And this is essential because if you can develop this sense of community, you also are developing a sense of informal social control. So informal social control very much flows from the social cohesiveness of a group of people. And so community crime prevention is very much premised on fostering the social cohesiveness, fostering the sense of community, and therefore fostering informal social control. So before you can develop this community defense approach, what's often needed is this community development approach. So before you can have informal social control, you have to develop a sense of community. And so community organizers will go in and they will organize communities, they will foster a sense of community, foster social cohesion, and upon that foundation, one can build a more effective community defense approach. In other words, more effective informal social control. Now, in addition to community organizing, we also include physical development, so beautifying neighborhoods, picking up garbage, getting rid of graffiti, getting rid of dilapidated buildings. Even community economic development is considered part of a community development approach. So we know that neighborhoods that are blighted and dilapidated and full of graffiti, for example, tend to attract crime. There are higher attractors of crime. Communities where citizens are involved in picking up garbage and beautifying it, nice looking neighborhoods, tend to be less at risk of attracting crime and disorderly behavior. So physical development complements the community development in the sense that you're physically beautifying the neighborhood on the premise that more attractive aesthetic neighborhoods tend to attract less crime and less criminal offenders. And finally, we can also include a social development approach in community development. And this is similar to the crime prevention through social development, which is fostering the social development of individuals within a particular neighborhood. So community crime prevention can really be broken into these sort of three categories of community defense, community development, and the community development is broken down into community organizing and physical and social development. So really four categories in total. But they're very complementary, and at the core of this community crime prevention approach is this whole concept of informal social control, of fostering a sense of social cohesion, fostering a sense of community, and fostering the ability of people to informally regulate their own environment, in essence, to take care of one another. The next alternative to the criminal justice system we're going to examine is what's called restorative justice. Like crime prevention, restorative justice is very much antithetical to the criminal justice system and the criminal justice approach. So while the criminal justice system and the trial aspect of the system is adversarial, the whole point of restorative justice is to be more conciliatory. It's to be more restorative. And so if a criminal trial brings together an offender and the state, and to some extent the victim, in an adversarial approach, restorative justice tries to bring a victim and offender together in a conciliatory way to heal the aftermath of a criminal offense or a criminal act. So restorative justice focuses on restoring the losses suffered by victims, holding offenders accountable for the harm they have caused, and building peace within communities. So it's a philosophy of an approach to crime control that is the complete opposite of the adversarial approach. Restorative justice is a process. It's a process where the offender, the victim, and all others who are impacted by a particular criminal act can come together and apply problem-solving techniques to resolve how to deal with the aftermath of an offense. So the emphasis of restorative justice is on restoration. So you're restoring the losses suffered by a victim, which the criminal justice system doesn't do very well. You're restoring the offender in terms of socialization. So you're trying to reintegrate the offender back into the community. You're trying to promote pro-social values. And you're also trying to restore the relationship between the offender and the victim, and also trying to restore and reintegrate the offender and victim back into the community. As we mentioned, with offenders, you're trying to promote pro-social, law-abiding values. And with the victims, you're trying to help them overcome the psychological damage and the material losses that they may have incurred as the result of a criminal act. There are essentially four principles of the restorative justice approach. And as we go through these, keep in mind how these principles contrast with the principles of the criminal justice system, and in particular the criminal trial and criminal sanctions as well, punishment. So the first principle is what we call encounter. And what this means is that restorative justice approaches attempt to create opportunities for victims, offenders, and community members who want to do so to meet and discuss crime and the aftermath. And you can see the difference here with the criminal justice system, in that the criminal justice system is the state versus the offender. So the state as the prosecutor and the offender as the defendant. Never in the system do you really have any effort to try to reconcile the aftermath of a crime between the victim and the offender. And so the philosophy here dates back, centuries, to where a crime was considered a private matter between the victim and the offender. And so in this case, this philosophy is very much prominent in the restorative justice approach. And the philosophy here is that certain types of crimes don't necessarily have to involve the state. They're between the victim and the offender. And so really it's up to the victim and the offender, with some facilitation, with some mediation, to come together and address the aftermath of a crime. The second principle is what we call amends and restitution, and that is that an offender must take steps to repair the harm that they have caused. And this is an absolutely critical aspect of restorative justice. And again, note the difference with the criminal justice system, and that really the criminal justice system very rarely, or at least seldom, includes steps where the offender takes steps to repair the harm that they have caused. The criminal justice system culminates in the punishment of the offender. They go to jail. There may be some restitution to the victim, but it's actually fairly rare. And so the whole system revolves around punishing the offender. With the restorative justice, it promotes the offender taking responsibility for their crime and then repairing the harm. So for most restorative justice programs, including those in Canada that focus on young offenders and youth crime, in order for an offender to get involved in the restorative justice process, they have to admit guilt. So in Canada, before they get involved in restorative justice process, and I'll talk about that process in Canada in a bit, they have to admit guilt. So that's the first step. They have to express sincere concern over the crime they've committed. They have to admit culpability, and then they have to take steps to repair the harm. And this is usually done after, as part of the encounter. So the victim, the offender, will talk over the aftermath of the crime, and then the very end of the process is where the offender will agree to take certain steps to amend his or her relationship with the victim, and to even fulfill some type of restitution. And that can be everything from simply paying back the victim if they stole something, giving back the item, or even fulfilling some type of community service. The third principle is what's called healing and reintegration. And this basically entails efforts to seek to heal the victim and the offender and to reintegrate them back into society. As we talked about in the last module, reintegration is an absolutely critical aspect of the criminal justice system, and it's also a critical aspect of the restorative justice approach. So the whole approach comes down to trying to address issues that result in antisocial behavior among offenders and may cause fear or psychological problems within the victim as a result of being a victim. And so restorative justice is very much a healing process. It's restorative. It's about reintegration. And again, this is in contrast to the criminal justice system, where there's not a lot of attention, especially paid to the healing of victims, let alone the healing or rehabilitation of the offender. So restorative justice is very much about healing and reintegration and restoration of both the offender and the victim within society. And the last principle is what we call inclusive or inclusion. And inclusion is basically providing opportunities for anybody who has a stake in a specific crime to participate in its resolution. And again, this is an acknowledgement that crime affects a number of people, the victim, the offender, but it also affects a broader community. So if a break and enter has occurred at a house in a neighborhood, then it doesn't affect simply the victim, although they're obviously the most affected, but it does have a ripple effect across the community, increases fear in community, it may result in more preventive efforts, but any kind of crime has broader implications for the community. But the important point here is that unlike the criminal justice system, which is really between the offender and the state, the restorative justice system is much more inclusive, and that basically invites anyone who has a stake in the crime, the victim, the offender, family members, community members, to participate in the process and to participate in the healing aspects of the process. So as you can see from these principles, they're very much in contrast to the adversarial approach of the criminal justice system, which very much places emphasis on the relationship between the offender and the state, as opposed to the offender and the victim and the broader community that's impacted by a particular crime. This slide you may remember from the last module. I include it because within Canada, the restorative justice approach has been institutionalized in the sense that it is considered the primary means by which young offenders are dealt with, or the majority of young offenders are dealt with in Canada. In other words, the restorative justice approach has been integrated as a fundamental approach to youth crime and young offenders through the Youth Criminal Justice Act. So as we discussed, Part 1 of the Act is concerned with extrajudicial measures, in other words, what we call diversions. And here, the objective is to use restorative justice instead of the court system. In other words, police officers, Crown prosecutors, and even judges are encouraged to divert most young offenders away from the criminal justice system, away from arrest, away from the laying of charges, away from the criminal trial, into a restorative justice process. So under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, each province has the responsibility to establish restorative justice systems in its communities, and this falls under the jurisdiction of the Attorney General of each province. And so people are trained to act as restorative justice facilitators within communities, and these facilitators basically mediate a restorative justice session between an offender and the victim and all of those involved affected by a particular crime. So what will happen, for example, in a police diversion of a young offender is that instead of laying a charge against a youth, say, who broke into a house, the police officer is strongly encouraged to divert the youth to the restorative justice facilitator. Now that facilitator will then initiate the process that basically entails the 4 principles from the previous slide, in particular encounter. They will set up a meeting between the offender and the victim, and then they will go through the restorative justice process. All these principles will kick into action. And a restorative justice process begins with, first of all, the offender admitting guilt, so they cannot be diverted to a restorative justice process unless they admit guilt, and unless they sincerely admit guilt. And that's the primary condition that a young offender must fulfill before engaging in a restorative justice process. And then the process itself is where the offender will meet with the victim. The victim will express the hurt that they have encountered through this crime. The offender will try to explain why they did it and the context. The community members might talk about it. So it can take a few hours, maybe an hour, maybe a couple hours to go through this. But again, the process is about the victim, the offender, talking about the offense, trying to go through a healing process with a trained mediator facilitating the process. At the very end of the process, there should be some type of meaningful consequences for the young person. And this is not simply admitting guilt and culpability. It's also about trying to repair the harm to the victim. And this may simply be the meeting itself. The victim may feel better after the meeting about the criminal act. And the whole process may end there. And it may involve some kind of reparations. Again, the youth paying back the victim or returning the item that's been stolen. But again, restorative justice is now a formal part or a formal alternative to the criminal justice system. And if a young person fulfills all the steps within the restorative justice process, then all the charges, if charges were laid, will be dropped. And if no charges were laid, then the matter will just basically put to rest. There'll be no criminal charges, there'll be no trial. If the young offender does not admit guilt or does not fulfill his or her end of the bargain, then they can be returned to the formal criminal justice system. Charges can be laid, and it can go through the formal criminal justice approach. So restorative justice is a formal process that's now in place for young offenders in Canada. Again, the vast majority of young offenders that enter the system are those who have not committed a serious violent offense. They're usually first-time offenders. So this aspect of the Youth Criminal Justice Act is really focusing on the vast majority of young offenders who are not at risk of being chronic offenders. And what's interesting about restorative justice is that it's basically based on systems of justice that have been used by Aboriginal people for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Not only within Canada, but the United States, and as far away as Australia and New Zealand. So restorative justice is also very much used for Aboriginal offenders, and they're starting to use it more and more with adult offenders, including adult offenders who've been involved in violent offenses. And so restorative justice is seen as very much an alternative to the criminal justice system, and many of its principles are antithetical to those of the criminal justice system. We're going to close off this lecture by talking about a public health approach to crime and criminality. And in particular, we're going to focus on the public health approach to drug and substance abuse and the relationship between substance abuse and other crimes. So we know that substance abuse in and of itself is a significant social issue. It's a significant health issue, not only for the individual consuming drugs, but it's a public health issue. With respect to the criminal justice system, drugs are considered a criminal offense. If you're possession or certainly trafficking in drugs, that's a criminal offense. So as someone who's abusing drugs and you're being processed through the criminal justice system, this is considered a criminal issue. So drugs in society, substance abuse, is considered a criminal issue. Under the public health approach, substance abuse and drugs in general are considered not a criminal issue, but a medical or public health issue. And so it treats drug addiction as a public and personal health issue, not as a criminal justice issue. And this is carried over into criminal offenses that have a strong relationship to substance abusers and the substance abusing population. So we know, for example, that many workers in the sex trade industry, prostitutes, have a substance abuse problem. We know that many people involved in break and enters or theft from cars or even armed robberies have a substance abuse problem. So not only is the substance abuse problem treated as a public health issue, but any resulting criminal behavior is treated as a public health issue and as a medical issue, and is treated as such. So in other words, instead of processing the addict through the criminal justice system, through the criminal justice system, they are processed through an alternative system that emphasizes a public health approach, addresses the causes of the problem, which is drug abuse and perhaps even deeper rooted problems like mental health problems. Now, drug courts have become the preeminent public health approach to substance abuse cases and substance abuse cases that involve other criminal implications. So in other words, substance abusers who are involved in criminal activity like break and enter or prostitution. So drug courts have been established to handle cases of non-violence substance abusing offenders. So drug courts are essentially problem-solving courts that operate under a public health approach. In other words, what they try to do is they try to deal with the root cause of the behavior, of the problem behavior, which is the abuse of drugs. And again, as I mentioned, it may be a mental health issue. And so it's an alternative to the criminal justice system in the sense that instead of prosecuting the offender and putting him in jail or punishing generally, they are diverted away from the criminal courts towards usually drug treatment detox facilities. Now, if they complete this treatment, they can be absolved of all criminal charges and they won't have any criminal record for this particular offense, and they basically don't have to go through the traditional adversarial criminal justice process. So drug court is generally made up of specially trained judiciary judges, prosecutors, defense counsel, probation officials, even law enforcement and social service providers, such as mental health workers or social workers, treatment facilities, who work together in a collaborative process to deal with the criminal offending population that has significant drug abuse or substance abuse issues. And again, the point is to get them into treatment, divert them away from the criminal courts into treatment, and if they complete that treatment, they will be absolved of criminal charges and address the underlying cause of their criminal behavior. So all of these actors work together to help nonviolent offenders basically reintegrate themselves back into society, address the causes of their criminal offending, and become productive citizens in society. And so you can see that it's a very much an alternative approach to the traditional criminal justice system, and it holds a lot of principles that crime prevention and restorative justice approaches advocate. So with crime prevention, it's very much about addressing the root cause of the problem. And as far as restorative justice is concerned, it's a less adversarial approach and one that seeks to treat the offender and reintegrate the offender through a conciliatory public health approach as opposed to the more traditional adversarial criminal justice approach. In Canada, drug courts have been in place since 1998. The first drug court was implemented in Toronto. And the federal government and the Department of Justice recognizes drug courts and have gone so far as to implement drug courts as alternatives to traditional criminal trial courts. And so currently we have 6 drug treatment courts in Canada, in Edmonton, Winnipeg, Ottawa, Regina, Toronto, and Vancouver. Again, they deal with nonviolent offenders, and the whole approach is similar to restorative justice in that it's a police officer or a crown or even a criminal trial judge that will divert the offender away from a criminal charge or a criminal trial process towards the drug court. And again, all these drug courts are specially equipped to deal with the specific circumstances of substance abusing population. So in addition to the traditional police and prosecutors and judges, you will have social workers, you will have drug treatment facilities as key partners in this process. And so I provided a link to a particular case study, which is the Vancouver Drug Treatment Court, which you could look at. But again, the important point is that it's an alternative to the criminal justice system in that it avoids addressing the symptoms of the problem, which is really what the criminal justice system does by throwing someone with a drug abuse problem in jail. A drug treatment court is quite the opposite. It's intended to address the root cause of the problem. And even in, I'll have to acknowledge that even in Bill C-10, that's been introduced by the Conservative government, even though that legislation is very punitive and increases sentences and has mandatory minimum sentences for individuals, for offenders, criminal offenders. It does include provisions in that bill to divert offenders who have a drug abuse problem to drug treatment courts. So like restorative justice, the legislation in Canada does try to emphasize or at least incorporate provisions that divert substance abusing offenders to drug treatment courts. You have some readings that are included in your module, and in general these drug treatment courts have realized some success. Generally speaking, the recidivism rate of individuals who have gone through drug treatment courts are generally lower than the substance abusing population that have been processed through the criminal justice system.